Okay, so it's a pleasure to be taking part in this e-conference organised by NCVO. My name is Akash Paun. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Government in Westminster, and I'm going to be speaking for about 10 minutes about coalition government and how it is working so far in this country. So we've had a coalition government in this country now for almost exactly 3 months. And in many ways, this situation that only in May felt so unusual already feels normal. In many ways, things have worked out a lot better. It's gone a lot more smoothly than many people initially expected. But it is, of course, very early days, so it does remain an open question. Is this just the calm before the storm, or are we actually likely to see the coalition sailing smoothly through the next 5 years which it intends to govern? So, as my second slide shows, we do have very limited experience in this country of coalition government. In fact, in the last 65 years, there's been almost unbroken sequence of single-party majority governments. We just had the brief experience of minority governments with the hung parliaments in the 1970s and then again in the 1990s under John Major. But other than that, coalitions haven't been seen here since the World Wars, since both World War II and World War I, and then between the wars too there was a coalition government in the 1930s. So for many people, coalitions maybe feel like a rather un-British way of governing things, and maybe there's an expectation it's not going to last and we're going to get back to so-called normality quickly. But when you look at the long-term trends in terms of elections and public support, as my slide 3 shows, you can see actually there's been this long-term decline in the support for the two large parties, for the Conservatives and Labour. So actually, since 1951, when the two parties together took 97% of the vote, they've actually declined pretty steadily to just 65% this time. And what that means, of course, is that, well, the Lib Dems and other smaller parties have increased in popularity, and so coalition governments, or at least hung parliaments, and either coalition or minority governments are likely to become more frequent in future. And what this means is the UK might be becoming more normal in a sense, might be moving into what is actually the European mainstream position. My slide 4 shows a map of the current governments across Europe, and you can see that in virtually all of those countries there's a coalition government of one kind or another, and in fact conservative, liberal, i.e. centre-right coalitions are particularly common at the moment. So there's lots of experience out there actually for the country to learn from, which is effectively what us at the Institute for Government have been trying to do in recent weeks and months. So, I mean, one thing we do know about coalitions, as slide 5 shows, is that on average they don't last as long as single-party governments, it's true, which is something people were concerned about in this country. We may see more instability, more frequent changes of government. But the difference isn't that great, and actually there's wide variation between different countries. So there are places like Austria, Germany, some of the Scandinavian countries where stable majority coalitions frequently last for their full term in office. There's other countries where historically there's been more instability, like Italy. But even there, things have actually changed quite a lot in recent years. So, I mean, stability of the government depends on many other factors. And in fact, single-party governments can also, of course, be unstable and short-lived. Another thing we know from international study, as slide 6 shows, is that the most frequent type of policy conflict between coalition partners, things that leads to the end of coalitions, the most frequent issue that comes up is finance, is tax and spend decisions about distribution, followed by decisions about economic policy. So, I mean, this is of course very relevant for the UK at present. The upcoming spending review is therefore likely to be a key, maybe even a make or break test for the coalition. So that'll be one interesting thing to watch. It's also interesting to note that, as slide 7 shows, the coalition in this country was formed very quickly, actually. The process lasted just 5 days, and that's longer than we've usually had as a post-election transition period. But that's only because we normally have majority governments. Compared to most other countries in Europe and elsewhere, we did this in a rush. And there is potentially a danger, or at least a challenge, that some difficult decisions may have been ignored, postponed, avoided at the expense of getting a deal done quickly. And my slide 8 shows a list of the areas where policy decisions have been deferred to policy reviews or commissions, and the compromise will have to be found later on, one way or the other. So that's one thing to look out for. Another crucial factor in the success of coalitions is that a workable balance between the interests of the two parties in the coalition is found, i.e. one that suits both sides, one that both party leaders can sell, if you like, to their own parties as being a good deal for them. That doesn't mean a 50-50 split, of course, because the Conservatives are the largest party. It does mean the Liberal Democrats will need to get enough out of it that, come the next election, it would have seemed worthwhile for them to be in government. And one way of measuring the influence, it's not the only way, of course, but is, you can see on my slide 9, which shows that although the Liberal Democrats have 5 out of 23 cabinet positions, which is a good proportion, it's roughly in line or even above the amount they would expect from the number of MPs they have. But what they don't have is control of any of the big spending departments where lots of these key decisions about public service reform are going to be taken over the next months and years. So there may be some scope for tension there if these big decisions feel like they're being too much dominated by the Conservative side. But of course, ultimately, the key relationship will be that between the two leaders, Clegg and Cameron, and as long as the two of them are in agreement about the overall direction of the government, then it's likely that these various challenges can be overcome. And so, what all that means is that we certainly will have very interesting, unpredictable few years ahead of us. My final slide, slide 10, shows a sort of indicative timetable of the different potential flashpoints or at least hurdles that will have to be overcome by the coalition over the coming years. So, some of the big ones are, if we have a referendum next year on electoral reform, obviously, local elections in England, also in Scotland and Wales, for the devolved assemblies. Those will be difficult times for the coalition to work together because they'll be competing against each other. Party conferences in the autumn you might see tensions within the parties. There'll be the spending review going on, and then obviously budgets every year after that, and also Queen's Speech every year, and on each of those occasions the government will have to come to an agreement on what's their agenda for the next year. So those are some of the points to look out for in terms of assessing how things are going. Already though, things have changed in quite significant ways. The political system has adapted, and that's had an impact on everybody involved in the system. So an interesting question for discussion in this conference is, how have things changed from your perspective, from the perspective of the of voluntary organisations, which are of course seen by the government as playing a crucial role in a lot of their agenda, the big society and all that stuff that you will know more about than I do. So, I'd be very interested to hear, in other words, your views on how things have changed, whether the relationship between coalition government and voluntary sector has improved, got worse, whether other things have affected the way you work. And I'm also just very interested to take any other questions and comments you might have about my presentation. Thanks very much.